Okay, why don't we get started here? Thank you everybody for joining. My name's John Cameron. I appreciate you all coming to the menu planning webinar with Wholesum. It looks like we've got a good group of people already on, and a handful that I plan on sending the recording to after this. So I appreciate you joining, and appreciate your interest in Wholesum. I know we can help streamline your menu planning for groups. It's great to see. I saw a good group of I looked at the list of registrants. We've got somewhere between 25 and 50 folks on board for today's call, and it looks like it's a pretty wide spectrum of industries. So it was fun to see a lot of sort of outfitters, university outdoor programs, a few ranches and summer camps, but all in the sort of like outdoor group menu planning field primarily, which is fun to see. A few quick logistics before we kick things off. One is at any point you should see a chat icon on your Zoom. You're welcome to drop a chat message if you have any questions or thoughts or comments there. Grace Brogan is on the call with me as well, my partner in Wholesum, and she is happy to respond to any questions or kind of interrupt me if I miss it along the way. So she'll be helping me as we move
Good morning,
forward.
everybody.
Thanks, Grace.
Yep.
Other quick pieces before we kick things off. One is I will have a recording of this, so I'll send it out afterwards, either later today or tomorrow, so you can review these at any point you'd like to. And then the last piece is, if you're interested in doing so, you're welcome to drop a quick line in the chat about what brought you to Wholesum, your experience level, and where you're kind of coming in from, where you're calling in from, so we can kind of just get a sense of who's in the room. So feel free to shout out in the comments if you're interested in doing so. Okay, so let's jump in. We have a fair bit to cover today. We might not use a whole hour, but we'll see how it goes. First, before we jump into the platform itself, just a really quick introduction. So Grace Brogan and John Cameron on the call. I'm John. We started Wholesum. It's hard to believe, but this spring is going to be 10 years that that Grace and I have been working on Wholesum to work to streamline menu planning for groups. We both came at it from slightly different angles, but the short version of the story is that Grace and I were working in industries that were feeding groups often, and we had a story that's probably really similar to you all, of having these lengthy Excel spreadsheets or access databases where we were trying to streamline menu planning. We were dealing with all the struggles of planning for groups, scaling to the right group size, dealing with dietary restrictions, generating shopping lists. And we were kind of doing this either in like pen and paper or in Excel for the nonprofits and outfitters that we were working with, and realized that there must be a better way. And so we started 10 years ago to build Wholesum as a tool that was more universally fit to streamline menu planning for groups. We're based in Missoula, Montana. Grace, anything you want to add as an introduction?
I think that covered it pretty well. Just that this 10 years of development really did include so much insight from all of you on the ground. We've been able to really strengthen and make this more powerful based on so much user feedback. So that's always been a key component of what we do and what has gotten us here. So I'm always thankful for that, and really impressed by all of the variable components that are in there now to meet the diversity of needs that that kind of collaboration has brought forth over the last 10 years. And we built this because there was a need, there was a gap. No one was doing this for anyone at scale. Yeah, I think that's a good summary.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Grace. Let me just move forward here. We talked about Wholesum quickly as the platform that we're going to be going over as sort of the lens to approach menu planning. And I wanted to give you a quick overview of the agenda for today. And I'm going to kind of shake this up a little bit and introduce it backwards. So what we're hoping to do is, first I wanted to share with you some tools out there for recipe ideas. Wholesum is first and foremost a tool for planning menus for groups, but there's also a community behind it of other outdoor organizations that have offered to share their recipes through they've sort of opted in to share the recipes with the industry. So I wanted to point you in that direction. Then we're going to go over the kind of the basics of menu planning, and I'm going to start that with the menu planning itself first, and then back into the kind of recipe creation and ingredient management. One of the neat things about Wholesum's longevity in the industry is that we started really simple and straightforward, and so that's sort of what I'm going to show you from the beginning is the fundamental tools for recipe planning and creating menus. And then there are lots of sort of bells and whistles that we can turn on or turn off as we want to. And we'll get into that later in the presentation. And then one of the big pieces here is dietary restrictions. So that we hear again and again is the biggest pain point for planning meals for groups in the field. And so we wanted to call this out of sort of some of the strategies that we've seen organizations use to manage dietary restrictions for groups, as well as some of the tools that are in Wholesum to get there, so we can jump into that. And then obviously time for questions and talking about pricing and options and those sorts of things as we need to. And we'll pause here for questions after each one of these. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we can jump into them if we want to cover anything. If we want to rewind and cover anything or clarify anything that we talked about. Okay, so with that, let me jump into the recipes and demo work here. So I'm going to close out real quickly and show you Wholesum. So hopefully you all are able to see my screen here. And I wanted to show you, this is, for those of you that are new to Wholesum, this is the dashboard. I'm logged in as a test account that I use for demos pretty often. And you'll see a lot of the main features that we're going to touch on today on this front page. So recipes, ingredients, and meal plans. But before I jump into that, I just wanted to show you the recipe collections. This is a tool that's available even if you choose not to use Wholesum. This is a place where you can jump in and reference recipes from other organizations that are using Wholesum actively. So they have, there's an option when you are subscribed to Wholesum to share your recipes. You can opt into that. And we've got a number of organizations here that have opted to do that. So if you're just in the place where you're sort of drafting up some ideas about what you might serve, it might be worth coming in here to take a look at other organizations using Wholesum right now that are maybe are similar. If you're a rafting organization, take a look at some of the river outfitters. If you're a backpacking organization, same thing, or a camp. You can come in here and kind of see what what recipes folks are using. And should you decide to use Wholesum, you can also pull this in and use this recipe and kind of align it with your existing ingredients. So that's a great place to start. Obviously, you can browse the internet or use your existing recipes, but this is a fun place to start if you're just trying to get some ideas. So with that said, I wanted to jump in and actually show you Wholesum, the tool for menu planning, and I'm going to do it sort of backwards. So the flow of work here is going to go from left to right, typically, where we're going to build out our recipes and the meals we're going to serve to our groups. We're going to manage the ingredients to say, here's the store or the brand or the cost of those ingredients, and then we'll build out our meal plan. But I'm going to show you the meal plan first so you get a sense of kind of where we're going with this. And then I think some of the recipe and ingredient options will make sense as we get into that. So I'm just going to start with a meal plan. What we see here is on the left are some folders that I can use or add to kind of keep things organized. And on the right are my actual meal plans that are coming up. And I'm going to just start with a new one so we can build one from scratch and play with it a little bit. So I'm going to say February webinar demo. We can define the number of individuals in this group. We can do that by appetite size if we want to. So you've got some small eaters or large eaters. And then for each of those, we can define the dietary restrictions. This is a customizable list, but we can say, of the 16, 3 don't do wheat or gluten, 1 doesn't do pork, and 1 doesn't do shellfish, something like that. And we can really customize the dietary restrictions on the group. And what this will allow us to do is to automatically have some substitutions. So you can set up rules to say, if somebody has a wheat or gluten intolerance, we're going to do some substitutions within an ingredient or within a meal. The next step is our actual menu planning. We can do that by day or by date. So I can say this is a 3-day group. On the left are all the recipes that we'll talk through soon. So I can throw in some breakfast options, can filter these. I can, I'll just add a few in here to make sure that we've got plenty to work with. You know, you can add multiple to each group. We've got it set up as breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack. I'll just throw some more in here just so that we have something to work with. And we'll talk through building the recipe list out shortly, but this is kind of a, you know, when you start this process, it'll be a blank slate and you can kind of add the recipes that you want to use. So I'll go with that for now. So this is our meal plan for the 3 days, and the last step here is these are all the recipes that I just added to the meal plan, and it's saying that it's going to assume that everybody on this group is eating everything. And if that's not true for some reason, because you've got people joining late or leaving early, or maybe you're serving 2 different meal options as one of the strategies to manage dietary restrictions, you can pull these back to say, you know, not the whole group will be eating these. So with that, I will save that meal plan. And we have a few ways of viewing this. You know, we do have an iPhone and Android app. You can view it here on the website, or a lot of people will gravitate towards the Excel or PDF export. So I'm actually going to just open up the PDF to show you what that would look like. So this is the output from this trip. We've got 16 people. Here are the dietary restrictions, and this is our shopping list. And we can customize the columns that show up here. Right now I'm showing the quantities we need. You can see the meals in here. So we need, you know, some olive oil across different meals. The store that it's purchased at, which we can define in the ingredients departments. There's some conversion tools that we can do, any notes that we want to put in there. So it's a comprehensive shopping list. And then I can come down and see our meal plan. So this is just the table that we just built along with the number of people eating it. And then each recipe is going to be scaled to the right size. So we can see this is what bacon and eggs for 16 people looks like. You know, if it was 30 people, it would be proportionally larger. So this is scaling up and scaling down to meet the different sizes. One thing I'll jump to here is bagels and cream cheese. I'm going to focus in on this recipe in a minute when we talk about dietary restrictions. But you'll see that because I said that there were wheat and gluten intolerant people on there, it automatically substituted the gluten-free bagels in there. So I have that rule set up to manage those dietary restrictions in there. I see a question about stores and geographies. So yeah, the question is, can you put stores in there that are in your area? And absolutely. So it's defined by, we'll get to that in just a second, but you can type in any store that you want to use, or a farmer's market, or if you're buying from a large vendor, you can define each ingredient's preferred store. And then these exports can actually be pulled for specific stores as well. So we can say, like, I just need to get my Costco list, and you can pull that out. So I will show that in just a second, Bethany. And price check, I see your question there. There is not any current price check. So it's basically defining the preferred store that you want to buy it at. And then there's some price tracking that I can show you, but it's pretty rudimentary in estimating. It's meant for estimating. So it's more just like, here's the approximate cost that we expect to pay for these. The hope there is that it gives you like a broad sense of the cost of your shopping list, of what you should expect. And I'll demo some of that in just a second.
John, there's one more question here from Lynn about specific dietary additions that you can make yourself, whether it's kosher,
yeah,
options. Yeah.
Yeah, let me jump in there real fast. Thanks for the question, Lynn. So one thing that we'll get to here in a minute is the settings here. And there's a lot that we can turn on and turn off as we'd like to. So we'll talk a little bit more about each of these. But to your question, Lynn, there's this dietary restrictions one, and we can customize the list. So it will come when you start with kind of a standard set of common allergens, and you can change these, remove them, or add them. I think the one thing that I like to flag for people when they're getting started is that the way that we have this designed, and the way that I think is best to think about this, is ingredient level restrictions. So a lot of people will say, okay, I'm vegan or I'm vegetarian, and you won't see a list on here that says vegan or vegetarian. Instead, we're focusing in on specific ingredients, because that way we can really narrow in on what are the restrictions that we want to avoid. So you know, you might have somebody who is vegan or is vegetarian but eats eggs or eats fish, And that way we can really zoom in here on like what specifically are we trying to substitute for. So with that caveat said, Lynn, there is a way to customize it there. Great. Any other questions there? Otherwise I can jump into, we'll come back to meal plans in a second to show you a few other tricks and tips, but that's kind of the main piece.
Might just add here, John. I'm glad you started with that, and just reiterate the reason you started that is because once you input your recipes, whether it's your fantastic, hard-earned recipes that you've developed over the last 20 years, or you're adding things, from some of the examples that have been shared by other users. Once all of that gets in there and you kind of update your ingredients as needed as you go, the meal plans is where you're spending most of your time because all of that kind of data is in there once you put it in there. And the meal plans is what you're using day to day.
Yeah. Thanks, Grace. Yeah, the recipes and ingredients piece that we're going to jump into here is setting this up is the most important step because it's basically defining the recipes and the ingredients that you're going to use in your meal plans. And so getting those right, taking the time to do that up front is super important, and it makes for these really clean and accurate meal plans once you get those in there. So let's start with recipes. So what we're going to do here is just take a look at my list of recipes and how to add them, edit them, and kind of what we can capture. As we do that, it's going to make automatically a long list of ingredients that are in those recipes. And then we can jump over there and start managing those. So we have a few ways to add recipes. So when you come in here, this is my list of recipes. When you come in here, if you're a trial user or if you're brand new to Wholesum, this will be blank for you. And you get sort of a clean slate to start from. And we have 4 different ways that you can add recipes. And I'm not going to walk through every single one of them in detail, but the first I've already shown you. We can jump into the collections and borrow one from any other organization and pull this into ours. When we do that, it will work to try to align the ingredients with your existing ingredients so we don't end up with a bunch of duplicates like garlic and cloves of garlic and minced garlic and whatever. We want to be really consistent about our ingredient naming. And so this is kind of a wizard that will help walk you through that process if you decide to import recipes from another organization. So that's one option. Coming back here, there is an AI tool that you can use to generate recipes automatically. The most common one, I think, are these two: the manually generated recipes or recipes from a URL. So let's show this one real fast. Recipes from a URL. Basically, if you're browsing around the internet and you find a recipe that you'd like to use in your list of recipes in your meal plans, you can come in here, and in most cases, you can just drop the URL right in here, and it will parse the recipe for you and generate the same wizard that will try to align. This is called a recipe calling for shredded cooked chicken, and maybe we already have chicken breast on here, so we can really kind of align the websites, any recipe that we find online with the kind of the process and system that we're using to make sure everything's clean and in line and consistently named and using similar units and that sort of thing. So this is another wizard to kind of make that process clean for you if you want to use recipes that you find online. And then the last way is often the most common way. It takes a little bit more time, but it's often the way that organizations go from the beginning if they're coming in with existing recipes and meals that they plan to serve. Like this, we've been in operation for 15 years and we've always served a similar menu to our clientele. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. So basically what we're going to do here is come in here and start adding a recipe manually, ingredient by ingredient. And I'll jump into one just to give you a sense of what that looks like. So here's a very simple recipe for bagels and cream cheese. I've said that this is serving 10 people, and this will scale up and scale down later. So the number of individuals served here doesn't particularly matter as long as the quantities of the ingredients align with the number of individuals being served so that it can scale up. So if we have a group of 20, it will double this recipe. If we have a group of 15, it will increase it by 50% and so on. And then we can add our ingredients and move them around as we need to. There are a number of different units you can use when adding them. So we've got whole like packages and bags that are sort of non-quantitative units. We have weights and volumes that are convertible between those units. And you can really decide what style, what units you want to use to build your recipe so that it translates to the shopping list accordingly. The only other thing I'll pause on here as it relates to building out the ingredients is that substitution rule. And so you saw on the meal plan that when we had 3 or 4 gluten-free people in our menu, in the group, that it automatically substituted. And what we can do is ingredient by ingredient, we can set up rules to say, for bagels, if somebody has a wheat or gluten intolerance, we're going to substitute those bagels for gluten-free bagels. And it will do this the appropriate amount based on the number of people with that dietary restriction in the group. And similarly for cream cheese, I can say if somebody doesn't do dairy, we'll do peanut butter instead for this recipe. To your question about cost earlier, this is where either here or in the ingredients you can define cost. And it's basically a tool that says we typically buy these by the dozen, and it costs $3.50 or whatever it is, so that you can kind of get an estimate of what each recipe should cost and each serving should cost.
And then that's manually input based on what you're seeing in your area, if that's something you want to be following. Don, I'm also seeing one more question from Bethany. An example being, what do you do if you buy bulk slider patties that are already done? How does that align with your shopping list and number of guests?
So I think the question, maybe Bethany, if you can clarify if I'm misunderstanding this, but the question is if you're buying items in bulk in advance of the group coming. So there are a few tools I can show you. Maybe I'll circle back to that in just a minute. I'll finish the recipes here and then we can talk about the ingredients. And there's a few tools we can use to manage bulk purchasing if it's not group specific. And yeah, so I'll put a pin in that and I'll come right back to it, Bethany, in just a second. The last pieces here on the recipe is just you can flag it for those dietary restrictions. You can categorize them so they're filterable, and you can also put in these custom tags of any sort of organization you want. And that helps you just sort of filter these out. So if you have 2 different kinds of operations, like maybe you have a camp kitchen that's more of a like front country, normal kitchen, and then you also are doing trips and you have different recipes for different environments, you can tag them for the appropriate environment so that you can really focus in on the recipes you want to use for those trips versus the front country ones or different locations, different styles. You can tag them there. So that's that. That's the recipe building part. Let's quickly talk about ingredients, and then I'll tackle your question, Bethany. The ingredients. So as I mentioned, when I build out these recipes, it will jump in here and it'll automatically add all of these ingredients. So you'll see, for bagels and cream cheese, here's my bagel ingredient. And this is a place where we can capture a bunch of additional information about that ingredient. This step is totally optional. You could just skip this completely if you want to, but it's a place to add more information about the bagel, about the ingredient, so to kind of add more detail to the shopping list. So examples of that would be like, don't buy onion bagels. We want this note to show up on the shopping list. We typically buy this at Costco. It's in the breads department. We can define our costs. We also have additional information we can save on that bagel. So what brand are we going to do? If you're doing online purchasing, and there's a specific item, you can link to that. Or if there's a number with your vendor, you can put that in here. All of these can show up on the shopping list optionally if you want to. Or if you're doing in-person shopping, you can even put the aisle number for it in there. And the idea is that you want the shopping list when it's time to go purchase for your group. You want to be able to pull a list to say, here's my list for Costco. I'm going to aisle 22. Here's my list from US Foods. This is the item number, and you can really get detailed in there. So to your question, Bethany, about buying in bulk, there's a few options here. So one is I want to highlight this purchase unit conversion. This might be worth having a separate conversation about at some point if you decide to move forward with Wholesum. But the goal here is in a situation where you're buying in bulk, say you're buying, let's talk about bagels again. We're probably not buying bagels one at a time. We're buying them either by the dozen, or maybe we're buying them from a provider that sends us, 100 bagels or 200 bagels at a time. What we can do is say, I buy these by the case, let's say the package, and it'll be 200 of these per one package. And what we can do now is it'll do some conversion so that we might, when we're actually cooking, we're serving these one bagel at a time. But when we go to purchase it, we want to convert that into how many packages do I need to purchase from my vendor. So this is a conversion tool that helps you do that. Another way of thinking about this is like weights and volumes. So a lot of time, rice is a good example. You'll be buying rice by the pound in bulk section or however. But when you go out in the field, you're serving it by the cup, or when you're in the kitchen, you're using cups to measure it. So you can do some conversion here to say, how many cups are in a pound, so that you get the right purchase quantity on the shopping list. So that's one component to your question about buying in bulk. This helps you kind of convert between those units. And then the second one, I'm going to jump away from ingredients to try to show you another trick for buying in bulk ahead of the season is, I'll just jump over here real fast, is we do have some tools to pull combined lists. So for example, this February webinar, maybe I made this as sort of a template. This is like my example one, and I know that ahead of the season, I'm going to be running, 20 of these style groups, because I have that many groups coming that are of this approximate size and approximate duration. And I can do pull combined lists to help here. So I can shop for multiple trips. Maybe I've got 3 groups coming up, and I can select those. Or if I know that I've got 20 of these style trips, I can multiply those out. And I can pull combined lists that give me estimates for what I need to purchase over a longer period of time, either for multiple groups or for a whole season, if if you have an approximate amount of groups already planned. So this can give you the quantities that you need to purchase before that group actually comes. So this is sort of group shopping. You can also filter this to say, we're just worried about bulk items, and I can pull a list that just shows me those bulk items that I need to pre-purchase. I don't have that many flagged as bulk right now, but you get the idea of kind of how you can filter this to show by store or by department, and merge and combine them all from there. I'm not sure, Bethany, if that answers your question, but feel free to clarify if there are other things I can do to highlight there. Okay, so we've covered a lot. Let me just jump back to my slides quickly. So we talked about recipe creation, manual, using the automatic recipe creation, borrowing them from other organizations or borrowing them from online. The ingredient management, there's a lot of detail you can add about each ingredient. And then we talked about creating menus and shopping lists as well. So I'm going to take a moment to pause there, because I know I threw a lot at you in the last half hour. And if there are any questions about sort of that core function, we can address those. And if not, we can move on to dietary restrictions and kind of the additional tools. So I'll give a minute. If there's anything you want to add to the chat, let me know. Okay. I'll keep cruising, but if you have questions that pop up along the way, feel free to add them to the chat and we can address them from there. So let's talk dietary restrictions next. And I've touched on some of this already, but I wanted to quickly kind of share what's evolved from our standpoint over the last 10 years as the different strategies for managing dietary restrictions. And then we can talk about sort of how you'd use Wholesum to tackle these. So I think of there as being 3 basic ways to accommodate dietary restrictions. One is the common denominator, one is the meal substitution, and one is the ingredient substitution. So by common denominator, what I mean here is a peanut allergy is a common one here, where if we have a severe anaphylactic allergy, that we just need to make sure that we don't bring any of these on the group. We're not serving them on the trip. We're not bringing them. We're not shopping for them for this group. We need to avoid them completely. We need to basically remove any recipes that contain that ingredient. And so there's this sort of common denominator strategy. It's a great tool for those severe allergies. It's not really a crowd pleaser. If somebody's gluten-free, we don't want to remove every recipe that has gluten, usually. Or if somebody's if you got one vegetarian person, we probably don't want to make the whole menu vegetarian. But it can be an effective strategy in certain situations. And then there's meal substitution. And so what I mean by that is if you've got a situation where you've got, let's say, somebody who is vegetarian or gluten-free, and you're serving pasta and meatball dinner, instead of trying to tweak the ingredients within that meal, you're just going to serve them a completely different meal. So they're going to get the gluten-free rice meal with rice and beans, and everyone else is going to have the pasta for dinner. So this is basically saying we're not adjusting the meal to meet your dietary restrictions. We're actually substituting the whole meal, so you're going to have a different meal option. So there's a tool in Wholesum I can show you how to do that. We touched on it briefly already. And then the last one we talked about already is the ingredient substitution. And I think this is the most common one, which is basically to say, we're all going to have pasta tonight, and I need to make sure that I bring some gluten-free pasta for those people that don't eat gluten pasta. Or I need to bring in some vegetarian proteins for those people that aren't going to have meatballs, that sort of thing. And so those are kind of the three strategies, and I wanted to just jump in and show you how in Wholesum we would tackle these. We've touched on the tools already, but we can kind of zoom in on them a little bit here. So let's talk about common denominator first. So for that, what I'm going to do here is make sure that in my recipe, I have flagged those ingredients that I need to potentially filter out, wheat and gluten and dairy in this case, if we've got, or this is just a bagel, wheat and gluten in this case. So we're flagging the potential allergen that is contained within that meal. And then from the meal plan, when I come in to edit it, one thing that we can see down here is on the filtering. So this is my meal plan. What recipes am I going to serve? We can just say, hide any recipe that contains tree nuts, or hide any recipe that contains wheat or gluten. And we're going to start to get a sense of what our options are. So basically we can hide those completely, create that common denominator, and plan an entire recipe or an entire menu, excluding those kinds of recipes. So that's the common denominator approach that works great in certain scenarios. The meal substitution one is really straightforward, and we talked about it a little bit already. So I'm going to say, just as an example, I'll get rid of this one. I'm going to put spaghetti and meatballs for dinner here. But if we have those individuals that aren't going to be eating this, and we don't want to deal with substituting gluten-free pasta and other ingredient substitutions, we can take a totally different meal and throw it on here. And then we're serving both of these meal options. And then the last piece we have to do is just to make sure that we're saying, okay, 13 people are having the spaghetti and meatball options, and 3 are having the rice and bean options. So here we're serving 2 different meal options, and we're indicating how many people are eating those. So that's kind of the way we would tackle it with meal substitutions. And then ingredient substitutions we already talked about, so I'll just do that quickly. But that is basically saying at the recipe level, I want to jump in and define the substitutions for that ingredient. So for bagels in this recipe, I'm going to set up a substitution rule. And this is going to interact with that. I'm going to jump back to the meal plan now. It's going to interact with these sliders that tell us, okay, we've got 3 gluten-free people. So the more I bring this to the right, the more gluten-free bagels it's going to bring on the shopping list, and the fewer normal bagels it's going to bring, because I've got that rule set up. So that's the kind of ingredient substitution piece. I'll pause there, see if there are any questions. Let's see. Yeah, great. I think a few comments in there, but I'm going to keep cruising unless there's specific questions. Great. I have a few other sort of advanced features that I wanted to share with you all. But before I do that, I know one of the questions we often have is kind of pricing and packaging. So I'm going to just jump to that part, and then we can jump into the more advanced features from there. Some of them will show up on the on this chart, so it'll start to make sense, I think. So we've got three basic plans, three general plans, kind of a basic, professional, and enterprise. Most organizations land somewhere in the professional or enterprise level, and you can choose between monthly and annual. So monthly being you're paying for that month, and then you can pause it at any time. When you come back, this is great for a seasonal operation. So when you come back the next season, all of your recipes and meal plans are still in there. You won't lose any of that. You'll just temporarily pause access, and then you can restart access for those months that you need it. Or if you choose annual, it's billed annually. You pay once for the year, and then you have access all year long. And there are some different features in here, and we can talk through some of what these are. Some of them you've already seen before. So, automatic substitution of dietary restrictions. We have some tools for rounding rules, PDF and Excel exports, and whatnot. So we can talk through a fair bit of this. But that's the basic structure here. It is priced in such a way that you can have one license per organization. So if you have multiple people using the same login, that's totally fine. So this is per organization. We do have a feature that you'll see on there that is for multiple users, and that is more for kind of like restricting access if you have seasonal staff or interns that you want to be able to help you generate meal plans, but you don't want them to mess with your recipes or ingredients. There is an option for that, but otherwise it's available for the whole organization. So I'll leave that there unless there are questions.
I was just gonna hop in
Yeah.
to say for those who do monthly instead of annual, often they like to start a month or two ahead of time so they can kind of be refining what they learned from the previous year. And that is also a reason that a lot of folks do annual, even if they aren't operating annually. Having that access
Especially the
can,
first year kind of
yeah,
idea.
can be really nice. We do have a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat box. I'll let you look at those maybe.
Yeah, let me take a look. So Lynn, I see your question about can you buy it for just 2 months of the year? Yes. So you can just select monthly here, pick the level, and then subscribe. And then at any point you need to, you can come in and manage your subscription to pause it or renew it later on as you need to. There's no minimum. You can just use it for the months that you need it. So that's no problem. And then I saw a question from Olivia that how do you adjust for how much people eat? For example, we had lots of extra food quantities last time we used it. Okay, yeah, good question, Olivia. So this one, I'm going to jump back to meal plans. So there are a few tools. One of the things I like to say, especially to new Wholesum users, is that Wholesum can be this, if you choose to, it can be this sort of iterative process of refinement. And so there's a few tools that we can use here if you're ending up at the end of a group with a bunch of extra food, which can happen. So one is keeping in mind that we have these appetite size ones. So if you know that you have a bunch of large eaters or small eaters, you can use that to manage groups. But even with that, you might end up a situation where, every single group that we have extra tortillas, or we have extra bagels, or we have extra whatever it is. If that is a consistent trend that you're seeing with your groups, I encourage everybody to kind of take stock of that, and then if it's a consistent enough trend, what we want to do is actually come in and adjust the recipe. So if we always are having, we're always serving bagels and cream cheese, and for whatever reason we always end up with extra bagels, what we want to just do is scale this down. So instead of 10 bagels for 10 people, maybe some people are skipping the bagels, and so we actually only need 8. And so by adjusting the recipe to become increasingly accurate, the more and more you learn about what are you short on for groups and what do you have excess, of at the end of each group, you can come in here and sort of refine the recipes so that it can become more and more accurate as you move forward. We had one outfitter that I worked with for a few years, and their first year of work of using Wholesum, what they noticed was a huge time savings. Was that they were just planning meals and menus much faster than they were before. But then this particular owner went back and did what I was describing to sort of take stock of what was extra and then refine the recipes for his second season. And he said that that process cut 20% off of their total food expenditures for the year, basically to just find out where there was excess and avoid that waste. Grace, was there something you wanted to jump in on as well?
I think you touched on it really well. Just that the iterative process. It's something that both you and I, when we were founding Wholesome 10 years ago, we're finding, and a lot of the folks we work with are ending up with extras. And by having a number of these tools to help you get more precise over time, and as you see what's happening with your meals in the field, then yeah, it's just a great way to be reducing that food waste, and saving that money that you wouldn't be spending on the excess food. But it does take some kind of looking at it. Um, yeah, but I think that's it. Yeah, a great example of a specific user. Um, and we've got so many stories like that over the last 10 years, about how this is saving headaches, or a significant amount of staff time and money, and that reduction of food waste. It does look like Bethany has a couple questions about quantities. And I know we kind of have it now kind of set up for like large eaters, small eaters,
Yeah.
but that kind of developed over time. Um, and that kind of depends on who you're working with and how you want to define that. But I'll let you jump into that more, John.
Yeah, sure. So to Bethany's question, we don't do it by grade level or age or anything like that. It's a little bit of a blunt tool, but basically this is where you would define. So in your example, if you had, 16 fourth graders, I would put them in this category versus if you had 16 teenagers, I'd probably put them in this category. And what you'll see here is that, if I have them up in this category, it's inflating it by 25%. So we have 16 people, but it's going to bring 20 servings of food when we map that back to the recipes. So it'll inflate it versus if I did the fourth grader, it would just bring 12. And then Lynn was asking if it prints out a final recipe to take on the trip. Yes, it does. So let me jump back to that webinar example, and I can export it here. And I can choose if do I need the shopping list or the calendar or just the recipe details. And if I just do the recipe details, or you can do the full thing. And what you'll get here is the final recipes here. So if you've added instructions, it'll come through here. These are the quantities that you need for that group size. If you kind of scaled it back, let me see if I've got a good example of that. So here's the chicken and broccoli casserole. I scaled that back to 11. So this will be, a decreased recipe. I think there was that one that I put down at 3. I'm not sure if I saved that or not. Yeah, maybe I didn't. So yes, this is kind of the recipe that you would send out for the actual people who are going to cook it, along with the instructions if you've got them.
And John, I would maybe hop back on that question about quantities. I know we
Yeah.
spoke briefly already, but just to say that this is another example of a way that we've found to develop over time how to meet that need for a lot of different types of groups. So it might mean that you've got a lot of adults and a few children, and that's how some people use it. And in your case, it would be different age levels. And so for each of our tools, we're finding ways to give the power to you to input the information as you see your needs and as you learn about them over time. So, we won't particularly know what quantities your teens versus your fourth graders eat, but you will learn that over time and can update that and get more refined
Mhm.
after a couple of goes. And then you'll be able to have that information and can streamline from there. So each step of the way, we're trying to find ways to meet a diversity of needs and really give that power to you. But sometimes you might have to go on a trip or two to kind of figure out what makes sense for your particular groups as you kind of refine your menus.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. Um, with the remaining time, I know we don't have too much time left, so I don't want to dig in to too much new content, but I did want to share this settings page that I showed briefly, and I won't go through each one of these, but I wanted to just highlight that these are out there so that there's a lot of customizing you can do. So you can adjust the columns that show up or how the PDF page breaks, things like that. When you export to Excel or PDF, you can adjust the column headers. If you want to do appetizers and dinner instead of just dinner, that sort of thing. I showed you the dietary restrictions. There are rounding rules. You probably saw in some of these shopping lists that there would be like, 14.2 bagels or something like that. You can set up rounding rules if that is problematic to see those kind of strange decimals on some things. There are some tools for packing. If you are an outfitter that has really specific packing needs to go into specific coolers and specific dry boxes or whatever you need to note there. There are tools that are worth talking through should you need them to deal with batch recipes. So that's particularly helpful for things like Dutch ovens or cakes or baked goods, where you're not just scaling it, larger and larger and larger with every additional person. You're kind of scaling it by batch. There's a tool I can talk through there if that's something anybody's interested in. And then there is this multiple users piece that I mentioned as well, where you can give someone access to specific meal plans, specific folders, and then give them specific access to either create, delete, edit, or view only the recipes, ingredients, and meal plans, so that you can kind of focus their abilities should you want to kind of get other people in here, or even if you want to get clients in to view their own or edit their own meal plans. There are options to do that. I won't go too in depth on any of those, but I will point you towards this help and support page. So we've spent a lot of time going through each one of those ones that I just called out. And if you're like, oh, I'm really interested in the batch recipes because we do a lot of Dutch oven pieces, I'm always available to talk you through it and demo it. But we also have a video and some instructions on each one of those features. So if you forget what we said, or you want to kind of revisit it, or if we kind of breezed past ingredient rounding, you can come in and take a look at kind of how it works for each feature. So that's also a great place to jump in. AJ, I see a question from you here. Is it possible to show on the shopping list if a recipe is used multiple times? Yeah, so let me jump in. It's kind of a small font, but what we can see here is if I go to, sorry, jumping around here. If I go to jump in here, you'll see right here, I'm not sure if you can see it on your screen, but there's a little number that shows you how many times it's been added to a recipe. So you can make sure that you're not serving the same options too many times. I think that answers your question, but let me know if you meant something else by that. You're also asking, but it all gets combined on the shopping list, which sometimes leads people to underbuying when shopping. So what we should see on here is, and let me know, AJ, if I'm missing the mark on this at all, is on the shopping list, what we should see is, let me pull it up again. And I'll look for a good example here. So let's just say the pesto sauce. So this is calling for, almost 13 jars of the pesto sauce. And it says we need 3 for the couscous and pesto, and 10 for the pesto pasta and chicken. So the idea should be like, this is how much you need to purchase, but these are the quantities in each recipe, which you'll also see in the recipe details down here to get those. Does that answer your question, AJ? Feel free to chime in if I missed that, if I missed the mark on that. Yeah, Mike, good question. There's a question about can we add tents or gear to the packing list on this? I love that, and I have seen some organizations do that. I wouldn't say that it's designed exactly for that purpose, but there's no reason you can't make like a gear or staples recipe. So one example I've seen, let's staying on kind of the food frontier, is a lot of people will do a staples recipe that is kind of their like spice kit, their ingredients that they're sending out that is not really recipe specific. They're just like, they always send a salt shaker, they always send olive oil, whatever it is. And that's actually a great use for that batch tool, which I didn't dig into much, but basically the batch tool is going to lock it to these quantities. It's not going to grow or shrink with the group size until it exceeds the number that you put in here. So as long as you got, in this case, fewer than 1,000 people, it's always going to lock it to these quantities and say, you know, regardless of the number of people, this is what we bring on that trip or for that group. So that's a great way for staple ingredients, but you can also use this for staple gear. So if you're always bringing, you know, one large pot or the stove that you're bringing, you can add those to a recipe like this, and it'll show up on that packing list. And then you can have a separate recipe that is sort of per person. So you can say one plate per person, one bowl per person, one fork, one knife, one spoon, that sort of thing, that will grow and shrink with the number of people on the group. So it's a little bit of a like hijacking the recipe to serve the need that you're describing, Mike, about like managing gear packing lists. But there's no reason that you can't use the recipe tool to do that. All right, any other questions? So we ran through a lot of this today, talked about a lot of the dietary restrictions, some of the advanced features. If you have questions about those advanced features that you want to set up a time for a demo to talk through them in more detail, or if you've got more features that you want to look into, or like workshop with your specific business process, I'm happy to dig into that as well. And then I'll leave this as our last slide. So first and foremost, reach out anytime. Email is great if you have questions or you want to set up a demo. I often will, as kind of the first step, do a half-hour demo with each organization to kind of talk through their specific food needs and processes. So reach out to me if that's something that you're interested in. There is a 2-week free trial with no credit card information needed. If you haven't already, you're welcome to sign up there. And then lastly is just to spread the word. We're a small, literally a mom and pop business, and we've been at it for 10 years, and we've grown to the level we're at right now, mostly through word of mouth and heading to conferences and whatnot. We don't spend a lot of time or money on advertising or those sorts of things. We rely on our customers to help kind of spread the word. So if you think of an organization that you think would benefit from Wholesum, please connect the dots for us. And with that, I'll leave it with any other questions that we have.
We do have 1 or 2 questions from Mike. And also, if you wanted, would you click back just to the actual Wholesum app, a web page where you were just a moment ago?
Yeah.
And it's something I always hit home. I know I already talked about it. But for those who are less familiar, it's always helpful to remember that third section, the meal plan section, that's really where you're spending your time once you're kind of getting all set up.
Yeah.
Your recipes and your ingredients, you can be refining and adding to whenever, when you're first starting, you might spend a good amount of time up front to get those really dialed in so that you're getting really accurate information. But once you go, that's kind of where all the magic happens, is in the meal plans. And that's where you're saving sometimes hundreds of hours of staff time in a season. So I just want to hit that home, and then maybe we can refer over to or put our attention over to Mike's question in the chat.
Yeah, I'm seeing that. It's a question about if we're going to continue to develop it to run off of AI. Yes and no, Mike. So one thing I'll say is, so right now we have 2 AI features built in. One is the recipe one, which allows us to generate recipes with AI here. I will say, full disclaimer, we just rolled out a brand new fancy design for our site, which you're welcome to explore. And it's beautiful and working great, but it added some kinks today that we're going to work through. So the AI tool is very much in beta, meaning in developer speak, it's like we're still working out some of the bugs with this. But in general terms, there should be general cases we should be able to create recipes manually here. And I wish I could demo it for you today. I should be able to demo it for you within a week or two. But the process here is really interesting, where it's actually gonna, if you typed in a recipe, it should first review your existing list of ingredients to say what are you already using in other recipes, and then build a recipe using those wherever possible. So it's a really clean way of generating recipes. I've been pretty impressed with it in the past, and I'd love to demo it for you at some point once we get kind of the bugs worked out of it. And then we do also have a small one where you can draft ingredients, using AI as well. So those two are in there. There's no immediate plans to go further than that, but it's such an evolving landscape that I wouldn't be surprised if we find more uses for it in the future as we continue to kind of grow and evolve.
Yeah, and these are two pretty straightforward ways where we're able to use that tool to kind of access the wealth of information of recipes, or to
Yeah.
help, create your description of how to make your recipe based on your ingredients and what we know those are often used for. So they're both pretty straightforward. And how long has that been out, John, that we've had it, other than just today when we updated
Yeah.
the kind of front page, and it
Yeah.
kind of
Affected the AI
updated.
tool. We rolled it out about a year ago. Yeah.
So it has had some practice,
Yeah.
and we've heard some great things from users about how it's helping things for them. If that's something they want, it certainly doesn't have to be used at all. It's just something that, again, we're trying to um, meet our users where they have some needs, and make things a little more streamlined for them if needed. But like so many of things, it's something you can use if you want, or not if you don't want to.
Yeah. And I think one takeaway that I've had in working with all these organizations over the years is, um, we've contemplated sort of like preloading this with a bunch of recipes for people, and what I've found is that lots and lots of organizations just have a nuanced operation that needs sort of the specific units, specific stores, specific ingredient names, specific brands, specific kinds of recipes that they want to serve in their kinds of groups, their kinds of environment. And so kind of like a one size fits all doesn't really apply in this situation. So we're trying to give you the tools to easily build the recipes that you want to use with your groups. And AI is one of those tools. Great. Unless there are other questions, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for everybody that joined us. And I appreciate you taking the time to learn more about what we're doing. I'll send out the recording to this webinar here in the next day or two, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or thoughts.
Thanks for being understanding of the baby sounds too. Literally mom and pop shop.
Thanks, Grace. Thanks, everybody. Take care.